Welcome back to Sci-Fi Travelers, friends. I'm back with another fantastic story. In this episode, we'll be listening to the tale of Lucas and Valentina, the most beautiful alien woman in the galaxy. Get ready to dive into the science fiction universe. Enjoy the show. I was stranded in the same cabin with the most beautiful alien woman in the galaxy. The coolant manifold on Deck 7 had opinions, and Lucas had spent the better part of 2 hours listening to them. It gurgled, it hissed. It made a sound like a cat being politely asked to leave a sofa. And through all of it, Lucas lay on his back in the crawlspace with a hydrospanner in one hand and a bulb of cold coffee balanced on his chest, murmuring encouragement the way other men spoke to racehorses. "Come on, sweetheart. Nobody wants to be replaced by a newer model. Just hold pressure for me." The horizon was 11 days out from Meridian Station, cutting through the long dark between systems with 400 souls aboard, and Lucas knew every kilometer of her plumbing better than he knew his own family. That wasn't a boast. It was, his last performance review had noted, possibly a problem. The manifold sighed, settled, and held. Lucas grinned at it in the dim red glow of the service lights. See, was that so hard? That was when the universe, which had apparently been waiting for him to relax, hit the ship with the fist of God. The horizon lurched sideways as if she'd been kicked. Lucas's coffee achieved brief, glorious orbit before painting the ceiling. Every light in the crawlspace died, flared white, died again. And then the alarms began. Not the polite chime of a pressure drop or the businesslike honk of a fire warning, but the deep, animal howl that every spacer knew from drills and prayed never to hear awake. "Hull integrity, all decks. Ion storm," said the ship's voice, calm as a tax notice. "Severity, catastrophic. All personnel proceed to evacuation stations." "That's not," Lucas began, hauling himself out of the crawlspace as the gravity flickered, went sideways, and turned the corridor into a funhouse. There was nothing on the charts. You can't just have a catastrophic ion storm. Storms have fronts. Storms have warning storms. The deck plating rippled under his boots. Somewhere below, with a sound like a whale dying, the main drive went dark. Lucas felt it in his teeth. The sudden absence of a vibration he'd lived inside for 6 years, and something in his chest went very cold and very quiet. He ran. The corridors were chaos rendered in emergency crimson. Crew sealing hatches, passengers clutching children and luggage they'd been told to abandon, the ship's voice serenely reciting evacuation routes as her body came apart around her. Lucas grabbed a sobbing steward by the shoulder, pointed him toward Pod Bay 3, shoved a drifting cargo container out of a doorway, and kept moving, because engineers do not get to panic until the work is done, and the work is never done. He almost made it to the engineering pods. Almost. Then the corridor ahead of him unzipped itself along a weld seam with a shriek of escaping atmosphere. The emergency bulkhead slammed down like a guillotine, and the evacuation system, an algorithm written, Lucas was now certain, by someone who had met him and disliked him, took hold of his fate with mechanical cheerfulness. "Rerouting," it chirped. The floor opened. Lucas fell, yelling words unsuitable for the ship's log, down a padded chute clearly designed by an optimist, and was fired feet first through the hatch of escape cabin 7. He landed in a heap of limbs and dignity, none of it arranged correctly. "Hatch ceiling," the cabin announced. "Occupancy 2. Lucas looked up. She was already strapped into the far couch, and she was watching him with the composed interest of a woman observing weather. His first, absurd thought was that someone had left a sculpture in the escape cabin, because nothing living had the right to look like that. Her skin was a deep, luminous sapphire, holding light the way the sea holds sunset, and her ears rose long and elegant through a fall of dark hair, swept back like the fins of something built for velocity. Her eyes were the pale silver of stars seen through ice, and they were, at this moment, evaluating him the way he evaluated second-hand reactor parts. Lucas became aware that he was upside down, that his shirt had coffee on it, and that he was staring. "Hello," he managed. "You're bleeding," she observed. Her voice had harmonics in it, layered tones beneath the words like a chord instead of a note. That happens when the ship throws you down a slide." He untangled himself, groping for the harness as the cabin shuddered against its docking clamps. "Lucas, engineering. I'd shake your hand, but I'm currently fighting this strap and losing." "Valentina," she said, and offered nothing else. The cabin detonated its clamps and threw itself free of the horizon. Through the viewport, Lucas caught one last glimpse of his ship, his beautiful, complaining, familiar ship, wreathed in crawling white fire as the storm ate her alive. And then the cabin spun, and there was only the planet below. A vast, blind, white face of ice, uncharted and unnamed, rushing up to meet them. "Atmospheric entry in 10 seconds, said the cabin. "Please remain calm." "Great advice," Lucas said. "Really actionable." Beside him, impossibly, the most beautiful woman in the galaxy laughed. One short, startled note, like a bell struck in the dark. The cabin hit the atmosphere and the world turned to fire and thunder, and Lucas's last coherent thought, as the ice came up at them like a fist, was that if he died today, at least the view inside the cabin had been spectacular. Lucas woke to the sound of his own name being mispronounced by a computer. "Occupant Lucas. Occupant Lucas. Vital signs nominal. Please acknowledge." "Acknowledged," he croaked. "It's Lucas like the name." "Noted, Lucas." He opened his eyes. The cabin was tilted 15 degrees, lit by the amber glow of emergency power, and the viewport was half buried in packed snow that glowed a deep, Arctic blue with the light filtering through it. His harness had bruised him in the shape of a harness. Every joint reported for duty with complaints. Across the cabin, Valentina was already up, moving through the wreckage of their supplies with an economy of motion that looked less like a passenger checking for snacks and more like a soldier inventorying ammunition. She'd found the medical kit, the ration locker, and the emergency toolkit, and had arranged them in a neat triage line. "You slept for 9 hours, she said, without turning. Her ears had swiveled toward him the moment he'd stirred, tracking him, he realized, like twin antennae. "You talk in your sleep, mostly to machinery." "Did the machinery answer?" "Not yet." Lucas unstrapped, slid down the tilted deck, and pressed his palm against the hull. Cold radiated through the composite like a warning. He made his way to the status board and read it the way a doctor reads a chart on a patient who has been hit by a truck. Structural integrity, adequate, which was engineer speak for wounded. Power, 41%, solar collectors buried. Heat, functioning barely. Water recycler, functioning. Oxygen recycler, functioning with an asterisk, and Lucas had never in his life liked an asterisk. And the distress beacon. "Oh no," he said softly. "Oh no, no, no." "The beacon is damaged," Valentina said. "I checked while you were unconscious. The transmitter array sheared off during the crash. It is broadcasting, but the range is." She made a small gesture, elegant and damning. "It's whispering," Lucas said, staring at the readout. "We're screaming for help at the volume of a library conversation." He pulled up the rescue computer's projection and watched it think. The screen produced a cheerful little animation of a ship, an orbit, and a timeline. "Estimated rescue window," the cabin announced. "Based on last registered flight plan and standard search protocols, 3 to 5 weeks. 3 to 5 weeks, Lucas repeated. "Or never," the cabin added in exactly the same pleasant tone. There was a silence. "That's a software bug," Lucas said. "That is a rounding error in the optimism subroutine. I'm going to fix that first." "Is it wrong?" Valentina asked. "That's not the point. The point is morale." He rubbed his face and did the math he'd been avoiding. Rations for 2-3 weeks if careful. Water, fine. Heat, fine unless the power dropped. Oxygen, the recycler was running at 80% efficiency and declining politely, like a man dying of something he was too embarrassed to mention. 5 weeks was possible. 5 weeks was also, if 2 or 3 components had opinions, a fantasy. They fell into the strange, bristling choreography of two strangers sharing 12 square meters of survivable universe. The cabin had one thermal blanket rated for its full crush weight, and their first negotiation over it lasted 40 minutes and ended in a border treaty Lucas felt he had lost. The rations were worse. The locker contained 14 flavors of protein block, and Valentina, upon tasting the one labeled savory herb medley, gave Lucas a look of such profound betrayal that he apologized on behalf of his entire species. "Your people crossed the stars," she said, "with this. Spite is a powerful fuel." But he was watching her, too, between the jokes. He couldn't help it. Noticing things was the whole of his profession, and Valentina was a system running processes she wasn't declaring. She ate with aristocratic precision but positioned herself always facing the hatch. She slept, when she slept, in brief, disciplined intervals, one hand resting near the emergency toolkit as if it were a weapon she hadn't chosen yet. And her ears moved, constantly, minutely, sweeping the frequencies of the frozen world outside. The tick of cooling metal, the moan of wind over the snow-buried hull, sounds Lucas couldn't hear at all. On the second night, the long-range comm, dead, supposedly, drowned in static from the storm's lingering charge, crackled. Just once. A half-second of structured noise inside the chaos, gone before Lucas could even reach for the panel. Probably nothing. Ionization artifacts, ghosts in the spectrum. But Valentina had gone perfectly still, the way only a hunted thing goes still, and for one unguarded moment her silver eyes fixed on the comm panel with an expression Lucas recognized from pressure gauges climbing into the red. "Just static," he said gently. "The storm's still settling in the upper atmosphere. It'll do that for days." "Of course," she said and smiled. And the smile was flawless, and Lucas, who had spent his life around machines that lied to him with perfect gauges right up until they exploded, did not believe it for a second. He said nothing. He handed her the savory herb medley, accepted her look of betrayal, and quietly began keeping a log of frequencies. The blizzard arrived on the fourth day like a creditor, and it did not intend to leave. It came down off the polar plateau with a voice that made the hull sing, and within hours the viewport was a blank white wall and the world had shrunk to 12 square meters, 2 heartbeats. Well, 3, but Lucas didn't know that yet, and the amber hum of emergency light. The cabin's exterior temperature readout dropped until Lucas turned it off, on the grounds that some numbers were nobody's business. "We're not going anywhere," he said, "and neither is anyone else. Silver lining. Nothing can sneak up on us in that." Valentina looked at the viewport for a long moment. "Some things hunt inside storms," she said, and then, catching his expression, added, "On my world. Old stories. Forget it." "Oh sure, forgotten. Completely forgotten. I will now think about it every hour for the rest of my life." Time changed shape inside the storm. There was no day, no night, only the wind and the small rituals of staying alive. Coaxing the oxygen recycler, rationing power, the ceremonial division of protein blocks. And slowly, in the way of two people who have run out of silence, the walls between them began to thin. It started with the auroras. The storm broke for an hour that first evening, just long enough to reveal a sky on fire, curtains of green and violet light crawling from horizon to horizon, so vast and slow they looked like the breathing of something planetary. Lucas stood at the viewport with his jaw slightly unlatched. "Your Ruth has these," Valentina said quietly beside him. "My world, but ours sing." "Sing." "The magnetic field oscillates in audible range. For my people." She touched one long ear almost shyly. "We hear more than you do. Wider, deeper. The sky over my city sounds like—" She searched his language, frowning, and settled. "A choir that has forgotten the words but remembers the feeling." "That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said in this cabin," Lucas said. "The previous record was me saying the water recycler passed inspection." She laughed. A real one this time, layered harmonics tumbling over each other, and Lucas understood suddenly that her people's voices carried emotion the way human faces did, that she had heard every feeling he'd had since he fell through that hatch, and that he was, acoustically speaking, standing in front of her stark naked. He decided not to think about that too hard. She asked about him, and he found himself answering honestly, which was unusual. The shipyard on Kestrel Station where he'd grown up, learning hulls the way other kids learned playgrounds. His brother Daniel, 7 years older, who taught him to weld and to swear, in that order, and who had gone off to the war at Corvan Reach and come back as a folded flag, and a service medal that their mother kept in a drawer, face down. That's why the engines, Lucas said, turning a coupling over in his hands. People lie. They lie when they say the war's almost over. They lie when they say he didn't suffer. Engines never lie. When an engine screams at you, it's telling the truth and it's usually your fault and you can fix it. He shrugged. I like things that can be fixed. Valentina was quiet. Then, on your Ruth, we say grief is a frequency. It never stops transmitting. You only learn to tune it. Your world has better sayings than mine. Ours is walk it off. That night he attempted to cook. This was, in retrospect, an act of hubris. The ration heater could allegedly transform protein blocks into stew, and Lucas, wanting, he would never admit, to see her smile at something he'd made, combined 3 flavors, added water, and improvised with the confidence of a man who had once fixed a fusion regulator with a belt buckle. The result set off the smoke alarm and the atmospheric contaminant alarm, 2 systems Lucas had not previously known could express harmony. The cabin filled with a smell later described in his log as brown. Valentina laughed until she had to hold the bulkhead, until her ears trembled, until Lucas, flapping a ration tray at the sensor, started laughing too, and for one warm, ridiculous moment the frozen planet did not exist. You have crossed the stars, she gasped, to burn soup. Water, I burned water. Show some respect for the difficulty. It was 2 hours later, with the cabin dark and Valentina asleep in her disciplined, too still way, that the comm panel woke him with a sound like a knife being drawn slowly across the static. Not noise, structure. A repeating lattice of pulses buried in the storm's electromagnetic wash, compressed, encrypted, and sweeping. Lucas knew a search pattern when he heard one. He'd written search patterns. He turned and found Valentina already sitting up, already watching the panel, and her skin had changed. The luminous sapphire draining darker, deeper, the color of ocean under ice, the color of pressure. Her ears stood rigid, fixed on the sound, and she was not breathing. Valentina, Lucas said quietly, who's looking for you? The signal swept past like a searchlight through fog, and was gone. For a long moment the only sound was the wind, scouring the hull like something trying to get in. No one, Valentina said. Right, Lucas said. And I ask because that's the second time no one has shown up on my spectrum log. First time was 31 hours ago, buried in the storm wash. Same lattice structure, different vector. Whoever no one is, they're triangulating. He kept his voice level, the voice he used on reactors in distress. I'm not asking to corner you. I'm asking because if something is hunting this cabin, I'd like to be rude to it in an organized fashion. Her silver eyes searched his face for a long time, and he understood she wasn't only looking. She was listening to him, to the harmonics under his words, reading his voice the way he read gauges. Whatever she heard there must have balanced the ledger, because her shoulders came down a centimeter, which on Valentina was a collapse. If I tell you, she said, you cannot untell yourself. There are safer ignorances. I burned water 2 days ago. Safety and I aren't close. And so, in the amber dark, with the storm howling like a chorus that had forgotten the words, the truth came up slowly, the way a wreck rises from deep water, first a shape, then a hull, then the whole drowned architecture of it. My name, she said, is Valentina Shireth Call, 3rd daughter of the Radiant House, Princess of Uruth. Of course you are, Lucas said faintly. Of course. I'm trapped in a shoebox with royalty. I offered royalty savory herb medley. Twice. I offered it twice. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Continue, please. She told it plainly, which somehow made it worse. Yareth sat at the crossing of 3 shipping corridors, beautiful, strategic, and small. To the rimward side of it sprawled the fleets of a warlord named Dravok High, who had spent a decade swallowing systems the way weather swallows coastlines. Yareth could not fight him. So the Radiant House had negotiated instead, and the currency of the negotiation was ancient and simple, a war bond, a marriage. The warlord would gain legitimacy, harbor rights, and a staging ground for his next decade of conquest. Yareth would gain survival of a kind. The third daughter would gain a husband whose previous wife was not discussed. The bond price was my world's safety, Valentina said. They told me I should be proud, that I was worth a planet. Her ears lay flat, and her voice had gone toneless in a way that Lucas suspected was, for her people, the equivalent of screaming. Every ship he staged from our harbors would burn someone else's home. I would be the signature on all of it. So 3 days before the ceremony, I stole a courier ship and I ran. And shamed 2 empires. Publicly, expensively, a ghost of a smile. The bounty on me could purchase a small moon. A tasteful one. Lucas sat back against the coolant housing, absorbing it. The iron storm, he said slowly, the engineer in him already assembling the ugly schematic. Storms have fronts, warnings. That one came out of nowhere on a clear board. He looked up. It was seeded. Someone dropped a charge cascade into the corridor and let it eat the horizon, because you were on the passenger manifest under whatever name you were wearing, and a dead ship tells no tales. 400 people, as camouflage. Yes, she whispered. The hunters that serve Dravok High do not capture. They erase and sift the ashes after. Lucas, your ship, your friends. Her voice frayed at last, the harmonic splintering. That mathematics is mine. I carry it. The cabin hummed. The wind howled. Lucas was quiet for so long that she turned to look at him, braced. He realized later, for fear, for blame, for the arithmetic of a man deciding a bounty was worth more than a stranger. Do they know you're alive? He asked. She blinked. What? It's the only question that matters. The sweeps are triangulating something. Is it you or is it doubt? He was already moving, pulling the panel off the beacon housing, laying out tools in a surgeon's row. Because our beacon is whispering our position and our occupancy, 2 survivors, cabin 7, to anyone with ears. That stops now. What are you doing? Committing light treason. He was elbow-deep in the transmitter, rerouting with quick, certain hands. I'm rewriting the telemetry. As of tonight, Cabin 7 broadcasts as an unmanned cargo pod with a corrupted registry and a leaking battery. Boring. Worthless. The kind of debris even a scavenger skips. He glanced up at her and grinned the grin of a man voiding every warranty in the galaxy. Congratulations. You are now officially a crate of agricultural fasteners. Valentina stared at this scruffy, coffee-stained human, rewiring his own rescue into a lie, docking his own odds of ever being found, for a fugitive whose war had already burned his ship, and something in the fortified architecture of her chest, some bulkhead that had held through a palace, a betrothal, and 3-star systems of running, quietly gave way. They will kill you for helping me, she said. They'll try, Lucas said, splicing. But I've got a blizzard, a princess, and a box of agricultural fasteners. Frankly, I like our odds. The scout came on the 9th day, when the storm finally exhausted itself, and the sky cleared to a hard, glittering black scattered with too many stars. Valentina heard it first. Of course she heard it first. Lucas was recalibrating the oxygen recycler, and narrating its shortcomings to it when she went rigid, ears snapping toward the ceiling, tracking something across the sky that human hearing wouldn't register for another 90 seconds. Engine, she said. Gravitic, small. It is sweeping in a search spiral and the spiral is tightening. Lucas's hands were already moving. He'd spent 3 days preparing for this exact unwelcome guest, and the checklist lived behind his eyes. Going dark, full corpse protocol. I have asked you not to call it that. Fine, full crate of fasteners protocol. He killed the interior lights, dropped the heaters to zero, and vented the cabin's thermal mass through the buried exhaust line he'd rerouted into the glacier itself, letting the ice drink their heat signature and dilute it across 1,000,000 tons of frozen indifference. The oxygen recycler he set to passive. The beacon kept up its dull, boring lie. Agricultural fasteners, corrupted registry, leaking battery, nothing here but disappointment. Then there was nothing to do but the hard part, which was nothing. They wedged together into the shielded hollow between the water tanks, the one pocket of the cabin lined with enough dense mass to smear their biosigns into ambiguity, and pulled the thermal blanket over them like children hiding from a myth. The space was built for one person or two very good friends. They became, of necessity, very good friends. "Your elbow," Valentina whispered, "is in my ribs. My elbow is the least of our problems. Your ear is in my eye. They move when I listen. I cannot help it. They're moving a lot. There is a great deal to listen to." The temperature fell. Their breath began to ghost faintly in the dark. And overhead, Lucas could hear it now, a low harmonic pressure more felt than heard. The scout ship crawled across the sky, dragging its sensors over the crashed trench like a fingertip reading braille. The cabin ticked and cooled. Valentina was pressed against his side, and Lucas discovered that her people ran warm, and that she had two heartbeats, a strong slow one and a quick light one laced between its beats, a syncopation, an engine with a second turbine. He must have made some small sound of discovery because she whispered, "The second heart is for emergencies." "What counts as an emergency?" "This," she said. "You may also hear it when I lie. It stumbles. My people cannot lie well. It is why we became diplomats. We had to learn to tell the truth in ways that deceive." The scout's shadow, or his imagination of it, passed over the buried viewport. Neither of them breathed for a while. And then in the cold and the dark and the enforced stillness, the confessions came, quietly, the way heat leaks out of a hull, because there was nowhere else for anything to go. "I have never been alone with anyone," Valentina whispered. "In my whole life. There were always guards, attendants, tutors, walls with ears. I was surrounded every hour and completely alone. A crowd is an excellent place to hide a person from herself." A pause. "This cabin is the most privacy I have ever had. It is 3 meters wide, it smells of burned soup, and the harmonics wavered, I have been happier here than in the radiant palace." Which is either profound or a symptom of oxygen deprivation. The recycler's at 79%, it's profound, barely. "And you?" Lucas watched his breath fog. "Opposite problem. After Daniel died, I got good at being alone. Ships full of people and I found the one crawl space nobody visits. Machines are safe. Machines break, but they break honestly." He hesitated, then let it out because the dark makes cowards honest. "I've fixed everything on this cabin twice. First time in my life, the thing I don't want broken isn't a machine." Her second heartbeat stumbled, not a lie, something else. Overhead the harmonic pressure faded, swept west, circled once like a suspicion, and finally faded toward the horizon and was gone. The cabin sensors confirmed it, sky clear. Threat departed. Neither of them moved apart. "It will report the trench," Valentina said at last, still against his shoulder. "Debris, no survivors, one worthless cargo pod. But Dravok's hunters do not close files. They will come back with landers and dig. Then we don't be here, or better, we be somewhere they expect, being dead." Lucas was grinning in the dark now, and she could hear it. The horizon shed wreckage across 40 kilometers of this glacier. Hull plates, a drive nacelle, half a galley. We build them a crash site. Bodies burned, nothing left, very sad, stop looking. And in case they don't take the hint. He wriggled out of the hollow and patted the salvaged capacitor bank he'd been hoarding like a dragon. "We build the icebreaker." "You named the weapon." "I named the weapon. It does not exist yet, and you named it. That's how you make things exist. Ask any engineer." Valentina emerged from the blanket, hair wild, ears at an angle he had learned meant reluctant delight, and surveyed him, frost-rimed, triumphant, vibrating with terrible plans. "Humans name everything," she said, "including, apparently, your doom." "Especially our doom," said Lucas. "It's how we make it ours." They came back on the 14th day, and they came back with landers. Lucas and Valentina had spent 5 days building a lie out of wreckage. 40 kilometers of scattered horizon had furnished everything. Hull plates dragged on improvised sledges, a burned drive nacelle, scorch patterns painted with fuel residue, and Valentina's contribution, delivered with a diplomat's cold artistry, 2 graves. Just mounds and a bent stanchion marker, the kind of detail that ends searches, because hunters trust grief more than they trust ashes. The decoy site sat 3 kilometers east. The real cabin lay buried under snow Lucas had packed over it with a thermal blower. Between the two, laced across the glacier like a nervous system, ran their preparations. Resonance charges salvaged from mining survey kits, drone lures built from beacon parts, and trenches Lucas had cut across crevasse fields with a plasma torch and an attitude. And the icebreaker. The Horizon's point defense capacitor bank married to a mining lasers focusing crystal, mounted on a cargo sledge, wired with more optimism than insulation. "Firing solutions?" Valentina asked, inspecting it. "1," Lucas said proudly, "1 solution. 1 firing, total. Then the couplings vaporize, the crystal cracks, and it becomes modern art." He patted it. "But it'll be a hell of a firing." The landers dropped at dawn, 3 of them, black wedges on pillars of blue gravitic light, settling around the decoy site like crows around roadkill. Through the salvaged scope, Lucas counted figures fanning out. A dozen hunters in segmented armor, sensor drones lifting off their shoulders like flies. For 1 glorious hour the lie held. The hunters found the graves. Their captain, taller, armor chased in red, stood over them for a long moment. Then he drew a slow circle in the air, and the drones scattered outward in a search pattern, and Valentina exhaled. He didn't believe it. "Everyone's a critic," said Lucas, and turned the first key. The resonance charges sang. It wasn't an explosion. It was a note, tuned to the glacier's own frequency, and the slope above the decoy site shrugged and let go. A white wall took the easternmost lander and 4 hunters and simply filed them elsewhere. The remaining drones shrieked toward the source of the signal, found the beacon-hearted lures Lucas had scattered across a crevasse field, and dove after them, one after another, into blue-black depths that did not give receipts. "Drones down," Valentina reported, scope steady. 8 hunters, 2 landers. They are advancing correctly now, spread, disciplined, angry. Angry is good, angry is sloppy. Angry is faster, Lucas. They fell back along their prepared line, and the day dissolved into a running, scrambling chess game played across the ice, trenches that funneled armored figures into fields of glare where their sensors bloomed white. Ice bridges Lucas had cut to fail, Valentina's arm proving to be a sniper's arm as she put salvaged survey flares into visor optics at 200 meters. She moved through the stormlight like something native to it, and between shots she called adjustments in a voice with no fear in its harmonics at all, and Lucas thought, "Warrior first, princess second, and the palace never knew." The icebreaker got its 1 firing when the lead lander lifted to reposition. The beam went out with a sound like the sky tearing, a lance of coherent violence that opened the lander's flank and dropped it, burning, into a pressure ridge. Then, exactly as promised, the icebreaker detonated its own couplings and became modern art. "I always suspected it would do that," Lucas said, on the ground, ears ringing. "You named it, you knew. But the arithmetic was the arithmetic." 4 hunters left, 1 lander and the captain in red-chased armor, and the fallback line ended at a shallow bowl of ice with the buried cabin at its heart. Which is where, in the blue hour of dusk, the captain cornered them, Lucas bleeding along 1 arm, half frozen out of tricks. Valentina with 1 flare left and nowhere to spend it. The captain's voice came through a speaker, flat and translated. Valentina Shireth call. Bond price of Dravok high. My contract specifies you breathing. It is silent regarding the human. A pause. Surrender and silence becomes mercy. He lives. Lucas said, don't. It is the only mathematics left, Valentina said quietly. Her second heartbeat, he could somehow hear it even now, was steady. Not lying, choosing. You gave me the only free days of my life. Let me buy yours. And she stepped forward, hands rising, ears flat, a princess assuming the posture of a treaty. And Lucas did the stupidest, bravest thing of his life. Cabin, he said into his collar com, protocol Daniel. Beneath the snow between them, the cabin's vented fuel reserve. Every drop he'd been bleeding into a slush trench for 5 days, for a version of this exact terrible moment. Ignited. The world went white and upward. The blast wave took hunters off their feet, took the dusk, took the ice itself, and the glacier's wounded crust, resonance-cracked and grieving, opened beneath the bowl like a trapdoor. Lucas got one arm around Valentina and one glimpse of the captain's red armor scrambling back from the collapsing edge. Then the blue depths took them both, and the ice closed overhead like a sky, and everything was falling, and cold and dark. Lucas woke falling adjacent, which is to say, on his back, on a slope of ancient blue ice, with Valentina's hand fisted in his collar because she had dragged him 30 meters from where the ceiling had followed them down. You detonated, she said, hoarse, somewhere between fury and wonder, our house. Insurance claims going to be a nightmare, he agreed. And then the pain in his arm arrived, and after the pain, the light, and they both went silent. The caves were alive, not figuratively. The glacier's deep heart was threaded with veins of piezoelectric ice, ancient compression squeezing charge from crystal, and far above, the auroras were burning. Their currents bled down through a kilometer of blue glass in slow rivers of green and violet radiance. The whole cavern glowed and moved, and it sang, a low harmonic shimmer where current met crystal, rising and falling like breath. Valentina stood absolutely still, ears high and trembling, and her eyes were bright with more than the light. It sounds like home, she whispered. Lucas, it sounds like Uruth. They were wounded, half-frozen, and hunted. The captain would be cutting down through the collapse within hours, contract in hand. Lucas inventoried what had fallen with them. His tool harness, 1 ration bar, 60 meters of line, and blinking on the ice where it had tumbled from a dead hunter swallowed by the same collapse, a military transmitter. Long range, encrypted, intact. He picked it up, and engineer to his marrow immediately took it apart. Can you reach a rescue channel? Valentina asked. Better. This thing punches through interference like an apology through a family dinner. I can reach anything. He paused, looked up at her, lit blue and green and violet by her singing, burning cave. Question is what you want to say, because we can whisper for rescue and keep running. Or. She was quiet for a long time, listening to the ice remember her sky. I have been fleeing in a straight line, she said at last, and calling it freedom. But the bounty exists because I am valuable, and I am valuable because the bond is still possible. Dravok cannot marry a woman the whole galaxy has heard refuse him. Shame is his currency, so. Her ears came forward, and her second heartbeat, when Lucas leaned close, was running steady and hard. I will stop being possible. They worked through the night, 2 silhouettes against the burning ice. Lucas gutted the transmitter and rebuilt it into something feral, splicing its encryption to broadcast in the open, bouncing the signal off the piezoelectric veins so the entire glacier became his antenna. A transmitter the size of a mountain that no jamming could smother and no triangulation could pin. They can't silence it, he said, and they can't find it because it's coming from everywhere. The planet is doing the talking. And at dawn, the planet talked. Valentina spoke in 3 languages, and the harmonics under her words carried across settled space with her name, her lineage, and her refusal, formal, ceremonial, irrevocable. The bond renounced, the treaty's price withdrawn, witnessed by open broadcast before 2 empires and every relay in the sector. She named the seeded storm. She named the horizon and its 400 and who had paid. And she finished because Lucas had scrawled it on the frost and she had, laughing despairingly, kept it. This transmission repeats. Indefinitely. You may all stop looking. I was never lost. The economics collapsed by mid-morning. A bounty on an impossible marriage is a bill nobody pays. Their scope caught the last lander lifting off the glacier before noon. The captain, red-chased and empty-handed, cutting his losses like a good businessman. Erasure had no client anymore. The rescue ships came on the third day, drawn by a beacon Lucas had rebuilt at full, honest strength. Its final weld executed, he made sure everyone knew with a fork. They rode the line up out of the singing dark together, and stood in the snow as 3 cruisers came down through the auroras, and Lucas realized he was not the man who had fallen down that chute. That man had loved machines because people leave. He looked at Valentina, wind-burned, renowned, free, and found he had fixed the one thing he'd never had a tool for, or she had. Grief is a frequency, he'd finally tuned it. They'll want statements, he said, debriefs. There's going to be so much paperwork about you. About us, she corrected. You committed light treason, it was in the broadcast footnotes. You footnoted me. Prominently. Then, as the landing lights swept the snow, there is a custom on your Ruth. One who saves a royal life is bound to it. The debt cannot be paid, only shared. A life for a life lived adjacently. Her ears dipped low, that slow, deliberate dip he had catalogued weeks ago and never once seen her fail to control. Valentina, Lucas said, is that a proposal? It is a treaty, she said with immense dignity. With very favorable terms. The auroras burned green and violet over the coldest planet in the galaxy, and Lucas took her hand, and it wasn't cold at all. Years later, on your Ruth, there is a room in the radiant palace that the attendants have learned not to tidy. It smells faintly of solder and coffee. Its walls are covered with disassembled things, clocks, comm units, an ancient music box, each one labeled in 2 handwritings, one precise and flowing, one barely legal. Visitors assume it belongs to a royal engineer. It does. It also belongs to a princess who, having spent her first life surrounded and alone, chose to spend her second one crowded into small spaces with one impossible human, taking broken things apart to see how they might be forgiven. They still argue about the thermal blanket. Some treaties are renegotiated forever. And on clear nights when the auroras sing over the city, they climb to the roof and listen, she with her ears, he with his hand against the stone, feeling the vibration the way he once read the heartbeat of a ship. He never did learn to hear the sky the way she does. It doesn't matter. She describes it to him, note by note, and he believes her, and that, she once told him, is what the singing is actually about. Because here is the truth that a frozen planet taught 2 runaways. We are all, every one of us, sealed into small cabins with strangers. A marriage, a family, a friendship, a life, with the oxygen running thinner than we admit and rescue further off than we hope. And in that small space, everyone eventually faces the same quiet arithmetic Lucas faced in the amber dark. When someone else's storm arrives at your door, do you protect your own air, or do you rewire your beacon and hide them inside your lie? When someone offers to surrender themselves to buy your safety, do you let them? Most of us will never answer with fuel trenches and burning glaciers. We answer smaller. We answer when a friend's disaster becomes inconvenient. We answer when telling the truth would cost us and silence would cost someone else. We answer, or fail to, a dozen times a year, in rooms with no auroras. Valentina spent her whole life valuable and finally chose to be free, and discovered they were never the same thing. Lucas spent his whole life fixing machines because machines break honestly, and discovered that people do too, if you stay in the room long enough to hear it. So the story ends the way the ice caves sang, with a question held out like a hand. Who are you sealed in with? And when their storm comes, When the signal sweeps past in the dark and they go still and pretend it's nothing, will you look away politely? Or will you say, quietly, the bravest thing anyone said in that entire frozen wilderness? Who's looking for you? And then stay. Welcome back to Sci-Fi Travelers, friends. I'm back with another fantastic story. In this episode, we'll be listening to the tale of Lucas and Valentina, the most beautiful alien woman in the galaxy. Get ready to dive into the science fiction universe. Enjoy the show.